It was a cold October afternoon at Windsor Castle. The wind howled softly through the stone corridors. Prince George stood alone near a tall window overlooking the courtyard below. He was only 10 years old. Something inside him felt older that day. Heavier. He pressed his small hand against the cold glass. Down below, the Queen's Guard stood perfectly still. Their red uniforms were bright against the gray sky. Their tall black hats made them look like toy soldiers. But George knew they were real. He knew they were trained. He knew they never moved. Not even when children laughed at them. Not even when tourists took photos. But today, something was different. George's eyes locked onto one guard standing near the gate. The man's posture was straight. His rifle rested against his shoulder. Everything looked normal. But George noticed something small. Something no one else would see. The guard's hand was shaking just slightly. Just enough. George's heart beat faster. He leaned closer to the window. His breath fogged the glass. He wiped it away quickly, not wanting to lose sight. The guard's eyes shifted left, then right. His jaw tightened. His fingers gripped the rifle a little too hard. Something was wrong. George looked around. No one else was watching. His parents were in meetings. Charlotte and Louis were with their tutor. The hallway behind him was silent. He was alone with this strange, uncomfortable feeling crawling up his spine. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what happens next. George's mind raced. Should he tell someone? Was he imagining it? Maybe the guard was just cold. Maybe his hand always shook like that. But deep down, George didn't believe that. He had watched these guards his whole life. He had studied them during boring ceremonies. He had tried to make them laugh when he was younger. He knew how they moved, how they breathed, how they stood. This was not normal. Suddenly, the guard's eyes flicked upward. For just a second, they met George's through the window. The man's face didn't change, but his eyes did. They were wide, afraid, desperate. George stepped back from the window. His pulse pounded in his ears. The guard looked away quickly, snapping his gaze forward again. But it was too late. George had seen it. That look wasn't just fear, it was a warning. George's hands went cold. He turned and ran down the corridor, his shoes echoing on the marble floor. He had to find someone. He had to tell someone. But who would believe him? He was just a child. And the guard had barely moved. He turned a corner and nearly crashed into Charlotte. She was holding a book, her face calm and curious. "What's wrong?" she asked. He grabbed her arm. His voice came out breathless and urgent. "Charlotte, something's happening. Down in the courtyard." One of the guards he slowed down, she said, her brow furrowing. "What are you talking about?" George glanced back toward the window. His chest rose and fell rapidly. He didn't know how to explain it. He didn't know if he could, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever he had just seen, ... It was only the beginning. Charlotte stared at her brother. She had never seen him like this. George was usually calm, thoughtful. He didn't panic easily. But right now, his face was pale. His hands were trembling. "George, breathe," she said softly. "Tell me what you saw." He swallowed hard. One of the guards. Down in the courtyard. His hand was shaking. And he looked ... scared. Charlotte tilted her head. "Scared, George? They're trained not to show emotion. Maybe you just know." George's voice was firm now. "I know what I saw, Charlotte. He looked right at me. His eyes, they were afraid, like he was trying to tell me something." Charlotte's expression shifted. She knew her brother. She knew when he was serious. And this was serious. "All right," she said quietly. "Show me." They moved quickly through the hallway, their footsteps soft on the carpet. George led her to the window. The courtyard stretched out below them. The guards stood in their positions. Everything looked normal. Tourists walked past the gates. A few pigeons pecked at the ground. "Which one?" Charlotte whispered. George scanned the courtyard. His eyes moved from guard to guard. Then he stopped. His stomach dropped. "He's gone." Charlotte frowned. What do you mean, gone? The guard I saw. He's not there anymore. Charlotte studied the courtyard carefully. Maybe his shift ended. They rotate every hour. George shook his head. No, it hasn't been an hour. And they don't just leave. Not like that. A chill ran through him. He pressed his forehead against the glass. His mind replayed the moment over and over. The shaking hand. The frightened eyes. The silent plea. George, maybe we should tell someone, Charlotte said. Her voice was calm, but there was a thread of worry in it now. What? George asked. That I saw a guard who looked scared. That his hand shook. They'll think I'm making it up. Charlotte bit her lip. Then we look for him. George turned to her. What? If he's not in the courtyard, he's somewhere inside. We find him. We ask him if he's okay. George hesitated. They weren't supposed to wander around the castle alone, especially not into areas where the staff and security worked. But Charlotte's eyes were steady, determined. Right, he said, but we have to be quick. They slipped down a narrow staircase that led to the lower floors. The air grew cooler. The walls were plain stone here, not decorated like the rooms above. This was the working part of the castle. The part visitors never saw. They passed a row of small offices, a storage room, a doorway that led to the kitchens. Then they heard voices. George grabbed Charlotte's wrist and pulled her into a shadowed alcove. 2 men in dark suits walked past. Security officers. Their voices were low and tense. Double quotes. Can single quotes find him anywhere? He was on the east gate 10 minutes ago. How does someone just disappear? Check the perimeter again, and don't let anyone know yet. We don't need a panic. The men turned a corner and disappeared. George and Charlotte exchanged a glance. Her eyes were wide now. We're looking for him, she whispered. George nodded slowly, which means I wasn't imagining it. They waited until the corridor was silent again. Then they moved forward, deeper into the castle's hidden passages. George's heart hammered in his chest. He didn't know what they were looking for. He didn't know what they would find, but he couldn't shake the image of that guard's face, that silent cry for help. They turned another corner and stopped. Ahead of them, a door was cracked open. Light spilled out into the dim hallway. George could hear something inside. A faint sound, like breathing, fast and shallow. Charlotte looked at him. George, ... He held up a hand. Slowly, carefully, he approached the door. He peeked through the crack inside. A man sat on the floor. His red uniform was rumpled. His tall hat lay beside him. His face was buried in his hands. His shoulders shook. It was the guard. George's breath caught. He pushed the door open slightly. The hinges creaked. The man's head snapped up. His eyes were red. Tears streaked his face. Ah, please, the guard whispered. His voice was hoarse, broken. Please, don't let them find me. The guard's face crumpled. She's my daughter. What would you do? George's mind raced. He understood. He would do anything to protect Charlotte. Anything to protect Louis. But this was bigger than one person. If someone dangerous got inside the castle, people could die. His family could die. There has to be another way, George said. There isn't, the guard said flatly. I've thought about it all day. I've gone over it 1,000 times. If I don't do this, they'll kill her. If I do, I betray everything I've sworn to protect. He looked at George with desperate eyes. So I ran. I hid. Because I don't know what to do. The room fell silent. George could hear his own heartbeat. He glanced at Charlotte. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set. She was thinking, planning. I need to tell someone, Charlotte said. The security team, they can help. The guard shook his head violently. No, they said they're watching. They said they have someone inside. Someone in the castle. If I talk, they'll know. George felt a chill run down his spine. Someone inside. That meant the threat wasn't just outside the walls. It was already here. What time is it? George asked. Charlotte checked the small clock on the wall. 4:30. 7.5 hours until midnight. 7.5 hours to find Emma, to stop whoever was behind this. "We're going to help you," George said suddenly. Charlotte's eyes widened. "George, we're going to find your daughter," George continued, looking at the guard. "But you have to trust us. And you have to stay hidden until we do."
Pact.
The guard stared at him. "You're just children." "How can you? We're not just children," George said firmly. "We're the ones no one will suspect. We can move around without raising alarms. We can ask questions. And we can get help without it looking obvious." Charlotte nodded slowly. "He's right. If you go to security, they'll lock everything down. If we go, we can be quiet, careful." The guard looked between them. Hope flickered in his eyes for the first time. "You'd do that? For a stranger?" George thought of Emma's face on that phone screen. He thought of how scared she must be. How alone. "You're not a stranger," George said quietly. "You've been protecting us our whole lives. Now it's our turn." The guard's eyes filled with tears again. But this time, they weren't tears of despair. "Thank you," he whispered. George turned to Charlotte. "We need to move fast. We need information. And we need to figure out who's behind this before midnight." Charlotte nodded. "Where do we start?" George's mind was already working. The phone. Whoever sent those messages left a trail. We just need to find it. The guard handed George the phone with shaking hands. George studied the screen carefully. The messages were short. Blunt. No names. No identifiable information. Just instructions and threats. "They used a block number," Charlotte said, reading over his shoulder. George nodded. "But they had to know his schedule. They knew when he'd be on duty. They knew he had a daughter. And they knew exactly when to take her. Which means they've been watching him," Charlotte said quietly, "for days, maybe weeks." The guard's face went even paler. "I never noticed anything. No one following me. No strange cars." George scrolled through the messages again. One phrase stood out. "Eastgate, midnight." He looked up. Why the Eastgate specifically? Why not another entrance? The guard thought for a moment. The Eastgate is the least monitored at night. There's only one camera, and it has a blind spot near the door. If someone knew where to stand, they could avoid being seen. "So whoever is behind this knows the castle's security layout," Charlotte said. George's stomach sank, which means they really do have someone inside. The three of them sat in heavy silence. Outside the small room, footsteps echoed in the corridor. The guard tensed. George quickly turned off the phone's screen and tucked it into his pocket. "Stay here," George whispered. "Lock the door after we leave. Don't open it for anyone except us." The guard nodded. "How will I know it's you?" Charlotte thought quickly. "We'll knock 3 times. Pause, then twice more." The guard memorized the pattern. "All right, please, hurry." George and Charlotte slipped back into the hallway. They moved quickly, but quietly, blending into the castle's afternoon rhythms. Servants passed them with trays and linens. No one looked twice at the 2 royal children wandering the corridors. "Where are we going?" Charlotte asked. "The security office," George said. "But not to tell them. To watch them." Charlotte understood immediately. If there was someone inside working with the kidnappers, they needed to figure out who, and the best way to do that was to observe. To see who was acting strange, who was too calm, who was avoiding eye contact. They reached a balcony overlooking the main security hub. Below, officers monitored screens and coordinated patrol routes. George and Charlotte crouched low, watching through the railing. "There," Charlotte whispered, pointing. "That man." In the corner, George followed her gaze. A security officer sat apart from the others. He wasn't watching the screens. He was staring at his phone. His leg bounced nervously. His eyes kept flicking toward the clock on the wall. "He looks anxious," George said. "Everyone looks anxious," Charlotte replied. "They're searching for a missing guard." George studied the man more carefully. He was young, maybe 30. His uniform was crisp, but his face was drawn, tired. Every few minutes, He'd glance over his shoulder, like he was checking if anyone was watching him. What's his name? Charlotte asked. George squinted at the name badge on the man's chest. Miller. Officer Miller. They watched for another 10 minutes. Miller barely moved, barely spoke. When another officer approached him with a question, Miller's whole body went rigid. He answered quickly, then turned back to his phone. It could be him, George said slowly, but we can't be sure. Charlotte bit her lip. We need more than suspicion. We need proof. George's mind raced. How could 2 children prove that a trained security officer was working with kidnappers? They couldn't exactly confront him. They couldn't search his belongings. And they couldn't tell anyone without risking Emma's life. Then an idea struck him. The guard's phone, George said suddenly. The messages came from a blocked number, but they still had to come from somewhere. If we can get someone to trace it? Who? Charlotte interrupted. We can't go to security. George thought hard. Then his face lit up. Oliver. Charlotte blinked. Your tech tutor. He's more than a tutor, George said. He used to work in cybersecurity. He's taught me about networks and encryption and digital footprints. If anyone can trace that number quietly, it's him. Charlotte nodded slowly. Do you trust him? Completely, George said. He's been with us for 3 years. And he doesn't work for castle security. He's independent. They hurried through the castle to Oliver's small office near the library. George knocked. A moment later, the door opened. Oliver stood there, mid-30s, glasses perched on his nose, a tablet in his hand. George. Charlotte. Is everything all right? George glanced down the hallway. Empty. He looked back at Oliver. We need your help, and you can't tell anyone. Oliver's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. Come inside. They stepped into the office. Oliver closed the door. George pulled out the guard's phone and explained everything. The messages, the kidnapped girl, the midnight deadline. Oliver listened without interrupting. His face grew more serious with every word. When George finished, Oliver was silent for a long moment. Then he held out his hand. Let me see the phone. George handed it over. Oliver connected it to his computer and started typing rapidly. Lines of code filled his screen. Charlotte watched nervously. George stood by the door, listening for footsteps. This is sophisticated, Oliver muttered. They're bouncing the signal through multiple proxies. But they made one mistake. What mistake? George asked. Oliver zoomed in on a string of numbers. They used a VPN to hide their location, but the VPN has a signature. A digital fingerprint. If I can match this fingerprint to a device inside the castle's network. His fingers flew across the keyboard. A map appeared on the screen. Red dots marked devices connected to the castle's Wi-Fi. Oliver filtered them one by one. Then he stopped. There he said quietly. A single red dot pulsed on the screen. George leaned closer. Where is that? Oliver checked the network log. His face went pale. That signal is coming from the East Wing security office. From a device registered to Officer David Miller. The room went silent. George felt his blood turn cold. He had been right. Officer Miller was the inside man. The one who had helped plan this. The one who knew the guard's schedule. The one who knew about the blind spot at the East Gate. Are you sure? Charlotte asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Oliver nodded grimly. The digital signature matches. The messages to the guard's phone came from Miller's device. He's the one who sent the photos. The threats. All of it. George's hands curled into fists. Then he knows where Emma is. Oliver looked at him carefully. George, this is beyond what you two can handle. We need to tell your parents. We need to involve the police. No, George said firmly. The kidnappers said they're watching. If we make this official, if we bring in police, they'll know. And they'll hurt Emma. Or worse, Charlotte added quietly. Oliver ran a hand through his hair. He looked torn. So what do you propose? George's mind raced. They had less than 7 hours now. They knew who the inside man was. But they didn't know where Emma was being held. They didn't know who Miller was working with. and they couldn't confront him directly without putting the girl in more danger. "We need to make Miller lead us to her," George said slowly. Charlotte's eyes widened. "How?" George turned to Oliver. "Can you send a message from the guard's phone? Make it look like it's coming from him?" Oliver hesitated. "Yes, but what would you say?" George thought carefully. "We make Miller think the guard is going to cooperate, that he's ready to open the east gate, but that he needs proof Emma is still alive first. He needs to see her, to know she's okay before he betrays everything." Charlotte caught on immediately. "Miller will have to contact his partners. Tell them to send proof. And when they do, we trace where the photo comes from," Oliver finished. "The metadata will show the location." It was risky. If Miller suspected anything, the whole plan would fall apart. But it was the only option they had. Oliver typed quickly, crafting the message. George read it over his shoulder. "I'll do it. But I need to know my daughter is safe. Send me a photo of her. Today's newspaper in the frame. I need proof she's alive. Then I'll open the gate." "That's good," Charlotte said. "The newspaper detail makes it sound real. Urgent." Oliver's finger hovered over the send button. "Once I send this, there's no going back." George nodded. "Send it." Oliver pressed the button. The message disappeared into the digital void. The three of them stared at the screen, waiting. 30 seconds passed. Then a minute. George's heart pounded. What if Miller didn't respond? What if he saw through the trick? Then the phone buzzed. Oliver opened the message. It was short, no words. Just a reply from Miller. "Understood? Wait for the photo." Charlotte let out a breath. He bought it. Now they had to wait. George paced the small office. Charlotte sat on the edge of Oliver's desk, her hands clasped tightly. Oliver kept his eyes on the computer, monitoring the network for any movement. 20 minutes crawled by. Then the phone buzzed again. George grabbed it. A new photo filled the screen. Emma sat in the same dark room, but now she held a newspaper. The date was clear. Today, she was still alive. "Oliver, the metadata," George said urgently. Oliver pulled the photo onto his computer and began analyzing it. His eyes scanned the code. They stripped most of it, but ... there. GPS coordinates. They weren't completely careful. He pulled up a map. A red pin dropped onto a location outside the castle grounds. An old warehouse district on the outskirts of town. Abandoned, isolated. "It's where she is," Oliver said. George felt a surge of hope, but it was quickly followed by dread. They knew where Emma was, but they still couldn't call the police, and they couldn't rescue her themselves. They were children. The people holding her were dangerous, armed. "What now?" Charlotte asked, voicing the question they were all thinking. George stared at the map. His mind worked through every possibility, every angle. Then something clicked. "We don't need to rescue her ourselves," George said slowly. "We just need to make sure the people holding her think the plan is still on." "What do you mean?" Oliver asked. George turned to them. "Miller expects the guard to open the east gate at midnight. If the guard doesn't show up, Miller will know something is wrong. He'll alert his partners, and they'll disappear. Or worse." Charlotte's face went pale. "So the guard has to go through with it." "No," George said. "I will." The room erupted. "Absolutely not," Oliver said immediately. "George, you can't," Charlotte added. "It's too dangerous." "Listen," George said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not going to actually open the gate, but I need to make Miller think the plan is working. I'll wear the guard's uniform. From a distance in the dark, Miller won't know the difference. While I keep him distracted, Oliver can send the location to security. They'll send a team to the warehouse. They'll rescue Emma, and by the time Miller realizes something is wrong, it will be too late." Oliver shook his head. "There are too many things that could go wrong." "There are more things that will go wrong if we do nothing," George said. "That little girl has been sitting in a dark room, terrified for hours. We're running out of time." Charlotte looked at her brother. She saw the determination in his eyes. The same look he got when he made up his mind about something and wouldn't be swayed. "I'm coming with you," she said. "Charlotte, I'm coming with you," she repeated firmly. "You'll need someone watching your back, and 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. Oliver looked between them. These were children. But they were also right. The clock was ticking. And sometimes, the most unexpected people were the ones who could make the biggest difference. "All right," Oliver said finally. "But we do this my way. I'll coordinate with security quietly. I'll make sure there's backup near the east gate. And the second anything goes wrong, you both get out. Understood?" George and Charlotte nodded. Oliver checked the time. "It's 6 o'clock now. 6 hours until midnight. Let's get to work." The hours before midnight passed in a blur of preparation. Oliver worked his contacts carefully, reaching out to a senior security officer he trusted completely. Someone outside Miller's immediate circle. Someone who could mobilize a rescue team without raising alarms. Meanwhile, George and Charlotte returned to the hidden room where the guard waited. They told him the plan. His face cycled through fear, gratitude, and guilt. "I can't let you do this," the guard said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your children. This is my burden." George knelt down beside him. "If you go out there, Miller will recognize you immediately. He'll know something is wrong. I'm your only chance. I'm Emma's only chance." The guard's eyes filled with tears. He pulled off his jacket and handed it to George. "The uniform will be too big. We'll make it work," Charlotte said. They did. Charlotte used safety pins and strategic folding to make the jacket fit George's smaller frame. The tall bearskin hat helped hide his face. In the dim light, from a distance, he would pass for an adult. Barely, but it would have to be enough. At 11:30, Oliver's phone buzzed. A message from his contact team in position at warehouse location. Standing by, Oliver showed it to George and Charlotte. "They're ready. Once they get the signal, they'll move in." George nodded. His heart was racing, but his hands were steady. Charlotte squeezed his arm. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "Yes, I do," George replied. They made their way through the dark corridors toward the east gate. The castle was quiet. Most of the staff had gone home. The night security was minimal. By design, George now realized, Miller had probably arranged the schedule himself. They reached the gate at 11:50. George took his position just outside the door, staying in the shadows. Charlotte hid behind a pillar 15 feet away, watching. Oliver remained at his computer, ready to send the signal the moment Emma was confirmed safe. George's breath formed small clouds in the cold night air. He could see the courtyard through the gate's iron bars, empty. Still then, at 11:55, a figure appeared from the security office. Officer Miller. He walked slowly toward the gate, his eyes scanning the darkness. George pressed himself against the wall, his heart hammering. Miller stopped 10 feet from the gate. He pulled out his phone, typed something, waited. George's borrowed phone buzzed softly. He checked it. A message from Miller. "Are you ready?" George's fingers trembled as he typed back, mimicking the guard's earlier tone. "I'm here. Is Emma safe?" A long pause. Then Miller's response. "She will be. Once the gate is open." George's jaw tightened. Miller wasn't going to confirm Emma's safety until the job was done, which meant they had to trust that Oliver's team would reach her in time. George stepped forward, to the dim light cast by a distant lamp. He kept his head down, the bearskin hat casting shadows over his face. He reached for the gate's lock, his hand hovering over it. Miller took a step closer. "About time," he said quietly. His voice was cold, detached. George didn't respond. He fumbled with the lock, buying time. Every second counted now. Then, from somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed. Miller's head snapped up. His eyes went wide. "What is that?" George's heart leaped. The rescue team. They were moving in. Miller's hand went to his radio. "Control, what's happening? Why are there sirens?" A crackle of static. Then a voice. "All units, We have a situation at Warehouse District, Sector 7. Hostage rescue in progress. Miller's face went white, then red, then twisted with rage. He looked at George, really looked at him, and in that moment George knew he'd been made. "You," Miller breathed. His hand moved toward his belt, toward his weapon, but Charlotte was faster. She stepped out from behind the pillar, holding her phone high. "I've been recording everything," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Every word you said. Everything you did, it's all here, and it's already been sent to the authorities." Miller froze. His eyes darted between the two children, then to the gate, then back to the security office. He was trapped, exposed. Footsteps echoed from multiple directions. Security officers appeared from the shadows. Not Miller's allies. Oliver's people. They surrounded him, weapons drawn. "Officer Miller," one of them said. "Hands where we can see them?" Miller's shoulders sagged. The fight drained out of him. He raised his hands slowly, his face a mask of defeat. George pulled off the bearskin hat, breathing hard. Charlotte ran to him, throwing her arms around him. They held each other, shaking with adrenaline and relief. Oliver emerged from the shadows, his phone in hand. "She's safe," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The team reached Emma. She's scared, but she's unharmed. They're bringing her to the hospital now." George felt tears prick his eyes. They had done it. Against every odd, against every expectation, an hour later, George and Charlotte stood in a warm hospital corridor. The guard sat beside them, his face buried in his hands. But these weren't tears of despair anymore. They were tears of relief. The door to a nearby room opened. A small figure burst out. Emma. She ran straight into her father's arms, crying and laughing at the same time. "Daddy!" The guard held her like he would never let go. His whole body shook with sobs. "You're safe. You're safe." "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry." "It's okay, Daddy," Emma whispered. "You didn't do anything wrong. You protected me." George and Charlotte watched from a distance, giving the family their moment. Charlotte wiped her eyes. George put an arm around her shoulders. "We make a good team," he said quietly. Charlotte smiled. "The best." Later, when the statements had been taken and the officers had asked their questions, the guard approached George and Charlotte one last time. Emma held his hand, her eyes wide with curiosity. "I don't know how to thank you," the guard said. "You saved her. You saved me." George shook his head. "You would have done the same for us." The guard nodded slowly. Then he knelt down so he was eye level with George. "You're going to be a great king someday. You know that?" George felt his cheeks flush. "I just did what was right." "Exactly," the guard said. "That's what makes you great." Emma stepped forward shyly. She held out a small, crumpled piece of paper. "I drew this. While I was waiting, I thought maybe it would make me feel brave." George took the paper carefully. It was a drawing of a castle, and standing in front of it, two small figures holding hands. "That's you," Emma said, pointing to the figures. "And your sister. The people said you saved me." George looked at the drawing, his throat tight. "Thank you, Emma. I'll keep this forever." Emma smiled. Then she did something unexpected. She wrapped her small arms around George's waist and hugged him tightly. "You're a hero," she whispered. George didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a boy who had been scared and unsure and had tried his best anyway. But as he looked at Emma's face, at her father's tears of joy, at Charlotte's proud smile, he realized something. Sometimes being a hero wasn't about being fearless. It was about being afraid and choosing to act anyway. It was about seeing someone in trouble and refusing to look away. It was about standing up when it would have been easier to stay silent. As they walked back through the castle corridors in the early hours of the morning, George thought about the guard's words. About being a great king. He didn't know if that was true. But he knew one thing for certain. When the time came, when people needed him, he would be ready. Because he had learned something tonight that no crown or title could teach. He had learned that courage wasn't about being the strongest, or the oldest, or the most powerful. Courage was about choosing to do the right thing, even when everything inside you was screaming to run away. And that was a lesson he would carry with him forever. The sun was just beginning to rise when George finally climbed into his bed, exhausted, overwhelmed, but at peace. Charlotte knocked softly on his door, peeking her head in. "Can't sleep either?" she asked. George shook his head. "Too much to think about." Charlotte sat on the edge of his bed. They were quiet for a moment, watching the dawn light creep across the walls. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Charlotte asked. "Not telling Mom and Dad first?" George considered the question. "I think we did what Emma needed. And sometimes that's more important than following the rules." Charlotte nodded. "They're going to find out eventually," George said. "And we'll deal with that when it comes." Charlotte smiled. "Together. Always," George promised. She stood and walked to the door. Then she paused, looking back at him. "George, I'm proud of you." He smiled. "I'm proud of us." When she was gone, George lay back against his pillows. Somewhere in the castle, a clock chimed 6 times. A new day had begun, and with it, a new understanding of who he was and who he could become. He closed his eyes, Emma's drawing clutched gently in his hand, and for the first time in a long time, he felt truly, deeply brave.